They called the verdant frontier a paradise, which was the first lie, and a neutral zone, which was the second. Male Sorvain had grown up inside both lies. Her parents were among the first humans to settle the biome. Xenoecologists who arrived with soil probes and cataloging equipment and a sincere belief that the great alien, Velkari Dominion, would honor the peace accords signed 11 years before her birth. The frontier was a strip of living world, 50 kilometers of bioluminescent jungle, thermal vents, and floating root networks that drifted 30 meters above the canyon floors like sleeping giants. The Velkari called it the Vereth, the boundary. They had agreed, formally and in writing, to treat it as sacred shared ground. Neither side would militarize it. Neither side would mine it. Neither side would. Male learned the Vereth the way other children learned letters. She could name every fungal bloom by its color pulse. She knew which root bridges would hold a grown adult, and which would pitch you into the canyon, like they were offended by your weight. She made friends, the kind of friends that don't use language, that communicate in pressure and light, and the angle of a head crest tilting toward the dawn. The Velkari who lived in the Vereth were not Dominion soldiers. They were what humans might call wardens, old ones. They tolerated her with something that eventually softened into affection. By the time she was 16, she could outrun any of them through the high canopy. Her parents had fitted her with a gravity harness by then. Standard issue for humans in the Vereth, where the atmospheric density was 15% higher than Earth standard, and the terrain made a broken ankle a death sentence. The harness was a slim exoskeletal frame worn across the back and shoulders, wired into a neural interface at the base of her skull. It read her intent. It responded like a second spine. With it, she could cross the thermal updrafts above the canyon and hang in the hot air 50 meters up, arms spread, the bioluminescent forest stretching below her like a circuit board, dreaming in green and gold. She thought of it as wings. The Velkari wardens watched her fly and called her something in their layered frequency language that her translation chip rendered approximately as the one who borrowed the sky. She wore that name like a medal. The Velkari boy who changed everything was not a warden's child. He was a diplomat's son, which in Dominion culture meant he was bred for ambition the way other species bred their animals for size or speed. His name was Steph Khan, and the first time he entered the Vereth, he was 17 years old and stealing a calibration crystal from one of the human research stations. Not because he needed it, but because proving he could take a thing from humans without consequence was the first step in a career built entirely on that principle. Male caught him at the perimeter. He was still holding the crystal, too surprised to run. She could have reported him. Instead, she held out her hand and waited until he gave it back. And then she showed him the canopy trail that led to the thermal ridge where the updrafts ran warm, and the phosphorescent moss bloomed in patterns that looked like old maps of somewhere none of them had ever been. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Their friendship was the kind that should not have existed. His people and hers had been in an armed détente for 30 years, separated by treaty and mutual distrust and the memory of the Miras engagement, where 1,200 humans and an unknown number of Velkari had died over a mining rights dispute that 3 diplomats in a room could have resolved in an afternoon. None of that mattered in the Vereth. None of it mattered when you were running the root bridges in the blue pre-dawn light, and the only thing that counted was whether you trusted the person beside you enough to follow their step choice. She trusted him. That was the whole of it. For 4 years they ran together. He never flew. Velkari didn't fly. Their bodies were built low and lateral, wide torsos and 6 limbs that articulated in ways human joints refused to. But he watched her fly, and there was something in his compound lens eyes during those moments that she eventually learned to read as a kind of longing. As if altitude itself was the thing he wanted and couldn't reach. He told her once, lying on a root bridge in the dark, while the canyon breathed warm air up through the gap below them. My father says the Vereth belongs to us, that humans have no right to walk it. My mother says the same thing about your people, Male said. What do you say? She looked at the phosphorescent moss. I say the Vereth doesn't belong to anyone. It just lets some of us stay. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I'm going to be somebody, Male. You already are somebody. No. His head crest lowered in the gesture she'd learned meant certainty bordering on grief. I mean, I'm going to be the kind of somebody that matters to my people, the kind they remember. She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer for it that wouldn't sound like a warning, and she didn't want to warn him. She still believed then that ambition and decency could coexist in the same creature. She'd had no data yet to the contrary. The peace accords came up for renewal when Mail was 23. Stefan, by then, was an attaché in the Dominion Diplomatic Corps, young for the position, which meant his father had pulled strings that ran all the way up to the Valkyrie High Conclave. He reached out to her through channels that shouldn't have existed between a human ecologist and a Dominion diplomat, and asked her to meet him in the Vereth, the old place on the thermal ridge. She went. Of course she went. He was different. She noticed it in the way he held himself. The slight adjustment of posture that in Valkyrie body language signaled a shift in hierarchical status, the way a human might straighten their spine after a promotion. His crest was higher. His movements were precise in a way they hadn't been when they were running the canopy trails. He was performing something, even here, even for her. But then they talked for 3 hours in the dark, and some of the old ease came back. And she let herself believe that the thing between them had survived the years of separation. That it was durable. That it was real. He asked her to tell him everything she knew about the Vereth's defensive infrastructure, where the human monitoring stations were, how the early warning sensors were networked, what the response protocol was if Dominion forces entered the zone in strength. He asked carefully, in the register of an old friend making conversation, not a diplomat extracting intelligence. He asked in the way that only works on people who trust you. She was halfway through her third answer before she understood what was happening. She stopped mid-sentence. He waited. "You're mapping our defenses," she said. "I'm having a conversation with a friend, Stefan. The accords are coming up for renewal," he said. "My government believes the current boundary is disadvantageous. The Vereth contains mineral deposits that. I know what the Vereth contains. Then you know what it's worth." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. His crest was perfectly still, which in Valkyrie expression was the equivalent of a blank face. It meant he was actively controlling his reaction, which meant there was a reaction to control. "You didn't come here to see me," she said. Something moved in his eyes. She'd never learned to read Valkyrie eyes the way she'd learned to read head crests and limb position. Maybe that was the gap. Maybe that was where the truth had always been hiding. "I came here because it was the most plausible cover for the intelligence requirement," he said. "I'm sorry, Mail. I genuinely am." She stood. He stood with her. "Your harness," he said. "I need to." She didn't hear the rest. The sedative was in the air, distributed through the Moss filter he'd been wearing on his intake valves the whole time. A Valkyrie military-grade dispersal compound, calibrated for human biology. She knew what it was the moment the edges of her vision softened. She knew it the way you know a thing that confirms the worst thing you'd always suspected about yourself, the thing that says, "You let this happen." She was unconscious before she reached the root bridge. She woke in the human med bay in the frontier station, with both arms restrained and a gap at her back where the neural interface should have been warm and humming and alive. It wasn't there. The harness was gone. They'd done it surgically. That was the detail that broke something in her that had never fully healed. They could have simply taken the harness. She'd been unconscious. The release latches were manual. But removing a neural-linked system without the wearer's consent required cutting the microfilaments that had, over years of use, grown into the tissue around her spine. They'd cut them, carefully. Whoever they'd sent to do it had been trained. The wound was clean and bandaged, and she wasn't in danger of lasting physical damage. She lay there for a long time, feeling the place where the harness had been the way you feel a word you've forgotten. That particular quality of absence that proves something was once there. Then she sat up, pulled the restraints off the medbay cot, because she'd installed them herself 2 years ago and knew the release, walked out of the station in her bare feet into the Vereth dawn, and screamed until the bioluminescent fungi in a 40-meter radius pulsed white with shock, and the root bridges overhead swayed on their anchor points, and the monitoring station's seismic array logged an anomalous reading it would classify incorrectly as a minor geological event. The scream didn't help. She'd known it wouldn't. She did it anyway. His name was Diaval. He was a xenobiologist field assistant. Technically, on paper, employed by the Frontier Station's ecology team, but in practice he was what the Valkyrie called a shadow reader. A small, quick, dark-feathered being from one of the Dominion's client species, with the kind of face that didn't register in other people's memories and the kind of mind that noticed everything. He'd been in the Vereth when they took her harness. He'd seen what they'd done. He found her by the canyon edge at dawn, sitting with her legs dangling over the drop. He sat beside her, which took courage. She was not a person you wanted to approach in the first hour after a betrayal. Steph Khan is being commissioned as Attaché Prime, Diaval said. He presented the intelligence on your defensive network to the High Conclave last night. They're calling it a breakthrough. He'll be appointed full ambassador to the human frontier within the year. She said nothing. The harness is in the Dominion diplomatic compound. They're studying the neural interface design. They want to understand how it integrates with Hyunshu. He paused. The Valkyrie find it remarkable that humans would modify their own nervous systems to survive an environment not built for them. Remarkable, she said. In their language, the word also means dangerous. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which remained one of the most honest things she'd ever seen any living creature do in that moment. "Will you work for me?" she said. "I already am," he said. "I just wanted to be asked." The years that followed were not kind years, but they were useful ones. Mail filed the harness theft with the Frontier Command. It was logged, investigated, and ultimately classified as a gray area incident under the Accord's shared zone provisions, which meant it went nowhere. She filed a secondary complaint with the Interspecies Relations Tribunal, also nowhere. She requested a formal inquiry into Steph Khan's use of the sedation compound. The Dominion provided documentation that the compound had been used in self-defense against a human who had become, their phrasing, emotionally destabilized during a routine intelligence exchange. She had no wings and no recourse, and the man who had taken them from her was rising through the Dominion hierarchy with the kind of velocity that suggested his people considered what he'd done not a crime but a demonstration of capability. She made herself into something the Vereth could use. Without the harness, she couldn't fly. So she learned everything that flight had let her avoid. The ground-level routes through the canyon, the pressure paths under the root networks, the thermal chambers where the Vereth's ancient biology did things that human science was still arguing about in peer-reviewed journals. She learned the Valkyrie Warden language in all three of its frequency registers, not the translation chip approximation she'd been using since childhood but the actual layered sound, produced with modifications to her own vocal cords, that the frontier medics had told her were technically inadvisable. She built a wall, not a metaphor, an actual defensive perimeter around the Vereth's human accessible zone, constructed from the frontier's existing sensor networks, rewired into an interconnected grid that would identify any Valkyrie military tech within 2 kilometers and respond with targeted electromagnetic disruption, the Dominion complained. The Frontier Command told her to take it down. She explained to them, in a document that ran to 47 pages, exactly why she would not be doing that. They let her keep it. Diaval fed her information from inside the Dominion's diplomatic apparatus. He was good at invisible. He moved through that world the way he moved through everything, unregistered, not quite there, a peripheral figure who turned out to know where all the important conversations happened. He told her when Steph Khan's career stalled. He told her when it resumed. He told her about the marriage to a Valkyrie noble line daughter, the political alliance it cemented, the son that came 2 years after. He told her everything, and she filed it, and the part of her that had once run root bridges at dawn, beside someone she trusted, went very quiet and did not comment. She was not happy. She was clear on this point with herself, in the way that certain people are rigorously honest about their own internal states. She was not happy, but she was effective, and in the absence of happiness, she had decided effectiveness would have to do. The commissioning ceremony for the Valkyrie Dominion's new diplomatic warship, the Sorvain Vel, which translated approximately as boundary enforcer, though some diplomatic notes rendered it more pointedly as the one who holds the line against humans, was scheduled to take place in orbit above the Vereth. It was a deliberate choice of location. Steph Khan, now ambassador prime to the frontier and the second most powerful figure in the Dominion's interspecies hierarchy, had selected it specifically. The ceremony would be attended by the High Conclave's full ceremonial guard, the captains of 12 Dominion patrol vessels, and representatives from 4 client species, and male. She arrived uninvited, which had required Diaval's best work over 14 months. The credentials she carried identified her as a technical observer from the Frontier's Ecology Division, attached to a monitoring team that the Dominion had agreed, in a footnote of a subclause of a renewal amendment, to allow into orbit during commissioning events. The agreement was real. The monitoring team was real. The rest was Diaval's particular gift, for making things be true that had not been true before he started working on them. She walked into the commissioning hall with her hands loose at her sides, and her face carrying the expression she had spent 3 years constructing. The one that said she was not threatening, not interesting, not the kind of person whose presence should change the temperature of a room. The hall was built Valkyrie, high ceilings, low light. The frequency-resonant architecture that meant the walls themselves vibrated with the conclave's ceremonial register. She felt it in her modified vocal cords. She let herself feel it, the way you let yourself hold the cult before you decide what to do about it. Steph Khan saw her before the ceremony began. Across 60 meters of diplomatic pageantry, through the ranked heads of 4 species and the formal crest displays of a conclave honor guard, he saw her. His crest went flat, completely flat. Valkyrie zero expression, the face they showed the void. She smiled. She waited until the ceremony's formal welcome had been delivered, and the assembled dignitaries had settled into the expectant quiet that precedes a commissioning address. Then she walked to the center of the hall. The security response was immediate and professional. 6 Valkyrie honor guard, fully armed, moving to bracket her before she'd taken 4 steps. She stopped, raised her hands, let them establish their positions. Then she addressed the room in Valkyrie, all 3 frequency registers, clean and correct. And what she said was not what the translation chips rendered. The chips said, "I am here as a registered observer per the terms of the renewal amendment." The original said, "I am the one you built your career on. I am here for what I am owed." The conclave members stirred. The Valkyrie don't have a word for Gaul in the sense humans use it, but they have 15 words for the specific situation where a lesser-ranked being stands in a place they have no right to stand and has not yet been removed, and the 15th of those words, the one reserved for situations where the lesser-ranked being might actually have a point, ran through the room in whispers. She looked at Steph Khan. "Your new warship," she said, "still in Valkyrie, still in all 3 registers, built in part with intelligence gathered from my body while I slept. From a defense network I spent 7 years building. From a trust I gave you freely because I was 23, and I believed that what you'd told me when we were running the Vareth canopy was actually true." She paused. "Your father would be proud. You are certainly someone they remember now," he said. "Remove her." "Of course," she said. "But before I go," she turned to the room. The 6 honor guard had not moved to touch her yet. She had perhaps 30 more seconds before they would. "Ambassador Steph Khan has a child," she said. "A daughter born 2 years ago. I know her name. I know where she is being kept during this ceremony. I have the access to read her." She let that settle. "I won't. I want to be clear about that. But I want you to know that I could. I want Steph Khan specifically to understand that the vulnerability he created, the gap between what he considers himself capable of and what he's actually done, is large enough for a person to walk through. I've spent years learning to walk through gaps." She looked at him again. His crest was still flat, but his secondary limbs, the ones Valkyrie used for fine manipulation, were pressed tight against his torso, in the posture Diaval had once ascribed to her as the position their bodies defaulted to when the cognitive load exceeded what the conscious mind could handle cleanly. "I'm placing a marker," she said, "a contingency, a protocol tied to my continued well-being and the well-being of everyone I designate. If that contingency is ever triggered, the consequences will reach your daughter. Not harm. I am being specific and honest about that, because I am not what you made me into. I'm what I was before you made me into it, and what I was doesn't do harm to children." She stopped. "But consequences. Things that follow her through her life. Doors that close. Opportunities that don't arrive. The specific quiet damage of growing up in a world that has decided your family forfeited its goodwill." The room was absolutely silent. "This is true love's curse," she said in Valkyrie, and the word she used for love was the oldest one in the language. The layered frequency glyph that meant both love and debt, and the specific grief of something given that cannot be returned. Something Steph Khan once told me he'd felt for me, before he decided that ambition was more useful. She looked at the child's name, written in her own handwriting on the small card she held, then set it down on the nearest surface. "Her 16th year," she said. "If contingency is triggered before then, the marker activates. If not, if the Dominion leaves the Vareth, leaves its people, leaves the treaty terms intact, and never touches what is mine again, the marker sleeps. That's the only way it sleeps. That's the only true love's kiss that breaks this curse." She nodded to the honor guard. "I'm finished," she said. "You can remove me now." The years that followed were not the years she'd expected. She had expected Steph Khan to come for her. She'd built her defenses around that certainty, calibrated everything to the assumption of an incoming threat. Instead, nothing came. The Dominion pulled back from the Verith's contested edge. The renewal amendment was signed with language that actually strengthened the human position. Stefan sent no communications, filed no grievances, launched no intelligence operations that Daval could detect. What came instead was the girl. She appeared in the Verith the same way everything unexpected appeared. Through a gap Mail hadn't known was there. She was 16, almost exactly. A Velkari human half-blood which had been so rare before the frontier opened that there was barely a scientific category for her. She moved through the Verith with the comfort of someone who had always known it, though Mail's monitoring systems confirmed she'd never been there before. She touched the bioluminescent fungi without fear. She spoke to the Velkari wardens in both their language and her inherited human one. And the wardens, who had never, in Mail's memory, shown warmth toward any Dominion figure, tilted their crests toward her in the low, slow movement that meant they recognized something in her that hadn't needed to be earned. Her name was Rora. Diaval brought the file. Mail read it in the monitoring station at dawn, coffee gold beside her keyboard, going through the information with the methodical attention she gave everything and the slowly building pressure behind Turnham that she identified, eventually and reluctantly, as emotion. Rora was Stefkan's daughter. Born to his Velkari consort, raised in a mixed-culture household that the Dominion's traditionalists apparently found distasteful, educated in both human and Velkari systems at her mother's insistence, currently running from a home she described in her personal log, which Diaval had obtained through methods Mail chose not to examine too closely, as a place where she was loved as an idea more than as a person. The 3 Velkari wardens Stefan had assigned to keep the girl safe during her Verith visit were, in Mail's professional assessment, inadequate. The oldest of them had been in the frontier for 40 years and had not updated his tactical protocols since the first peace accords. The other 2 were younger than Rora. She sat with that for 3 days. She was very good at sitting with difficult things. On the 4th day, she told Diaval to tell the wardens very politely that she was going to walk the canopy trail with Rora herself that afternoon. The wardens conveyed this to Rora. Rora, according to Diaval's report of the warden's communication, responded by saying, "I know who that is, yes." Rora was not what she'd expected. Mail had been expecting Stefkan's daughter, and found instead a person who was nobody's daughter in the sense that mattered. Not owned by either inheritance, not shaped primarily by the man who had fathered her. She was curious in the specific way that people who've grown up between worlds become curious. Not about any single thing, but about the mechanism of difference itself, the question of how 2 things that seem incompatible can occupy the same space without resolving into one or the other. She asked good questions. She didn't fill silence with noise. She watched the Verith, the way Mail had watched it at 16, with the specific quality of attention. That means you're trying to remember everything, because you know you can't stay. She didn't ask about the marker. She'd clearly been told about it, or deduced it, which seemed more likely given the quality of her mind, but she didn't ask. She asked instead about the harness. "I saw the interface scars," she said. "They were on the thermal ridge, the same ridge where Mail had sat with Stefan 20 years ago, and the symmetry of it was the kinds of things she'd learned not to comment on. On your back, when you reached for the handhold on the upper canopy. Old surgery," Mail said. "My father did that, or had it done." Mail looked at her. Rora held the eye contact. "I know what he is," Rora said. Not with bitterness. That was the thing that Mail had not expected. Not with the performed neutrality of someone trying to seem objective. With the flat, clear sadness of someone who'd already done the work of understanding, a parent they couldn't stop loving, and had arrived at an honest account of what was there. He's brilliant and he's principled about things that don't require courage. He does hard things easily and easy things like they're impossible. He loves me as a concept. I think I'm the only thing in his life he didn't plan." She was quiet for a moment. "And the marker," she said, "the contingency, the thing that follows me. It was never going to activate," Mail said. "I want to be honest about that. I built it to create an incentive structure, not to cause you harm. You were 2 years old, I know." Rora looked out over the canyon. The bioluminescent root networks were drifting in the thermal current, slow and enormous and indifferent to everything below them. "You've been watching me, it wasn't a question." "Yes," Mail said. "For how long?" "Since you arrived in the Verith. Before that?" The honest answer was, for 8 years through Diaval's intelligence network, in the way that someone who has placed a contingency on a child keeps track of the child. The honest answer was also, and in the last 3 years, increasingly, for reasons that had stopped being strategic and started being something else that she was still working out what to call. Yes, she said. Rora nodded. She'd known. Of course she'd known. She was smart, and she'd been raised by a man who specialized in knowing when he was being watched. There's a mobilization, Rora said. Dominion forces. Along the Verith's eastern boundary. My father requested it 6 months ago, and it's been approved at the conclave level. I think he's decided the marker is a bluff. She turned to look at Mail. It's not, is it? No, and you'd rather it not activate. I'd rather the mobilization didn't happen. So would I. Rora's voice was very steady. I came to the Verith because I thought if I was here, if I was visibly, publicly, genuinely here, on this ground, in this place, it would be harder for him to do what he's planning. That the optics would complicate it. She paused. I know that sounds very cold, it sounds very clear-eyed. I love the Verith, Rora said, and the way she said it made Mail believe her completely. I don't want to see it destroyed. I don't want to be the reason either. A small pause. And I don't want to lose what I came here to find. What did you come here to find? The girl looked at her with her father's compound lens eyes and her mother's human-readable face and said, someone who chose it. The way you chose it. The mobilization came 3 weeks later, faster than Diaval's intelligence had suggested it would. Steph Khan had been moving pieces while they were watching the board, which was the move she'd always respected about him, even when she'd hated him for it. The Dominion forces entered the Verith's eastern boundary at 0300, 6 patrol craft, 40 ground units, a signal disruptor that went for her sensor grid first. The grid held. She'd built it for exactly this. She triggered 3 responses simultaneously. The electromagnetic disruption on the lead patrol craft's nav systems, the Frontier Command emergency line, and the channel to Rora's comm unit. Get out of the Verith, she said. No, Rora said. It's not a request, I know, no anyway. She didn't have time to argue. She was already moving. The fight through the Eastern Canyon was not the kind of fight that looks like anything from the outside. It was tactical and methodical and ugly, which is what real fights are. Diaval moved with her, taking on the function the harness could no longer serve, feeding her positional data through their comms link, calling the routes, covering her flanks with the particular fearlessness of someone who has decided that the person they're working for is worth the risk, and has stopped revisiting that decision. She used the Verith. She knew it better than they did, had always known it better. And a military force moving through unfamiliar terrain in the dark against the enemy in 20 years learning in every thermal vent and route anchor point is not a military force that's been given a fair briefing on what they're walking into. She was not a soldier. She was something more inconvenient. She was a person who lived here. The sensor grid disrupted 2 of the 6 patrol craft. The third crashed a route bridge, which triggered a cascade failure in the anchor network that dropped 6 tons of ancient bioluminescent biomass on the ground unit below it. And no one died in this. But the Verith itself was very clear about its opinion of the intrusion. The 4th craft, the 5th, and the 6th regrouped, and then Steph Khan arrived. He came in the command shuttle, the one she'd tracked in Diaval's intelligence reports. Armored, fast. The kind of vehicle that says its passenger knew there was a fight, and had calculated that they would win it. He landed in the clearing by the thermal ridge, because that was the logical landing site. She was waiting in the shadow of the route overhang, because she had always known he would land there. She was on the ground. He had 6 armored guard units with him, and she was one person without a harness in the dark. He understood the asymmetry. He'd built his entire career on asymmetry. You built this well, he said, looking at her sensor grid's disruption pattern displayed on the scanner in his hand. It was better than I modeled. I had good reason to build it well. The marker, he said. You'll trigger it. I know. Then why are we here? What does this gain you? She looked at him across the clearing. He had not changed as much as she'd expected. The crest was higher, the limb articulation more deliberate. The posture of command that he'd been practicing since he was 17, and standing in the Verith canopy telling her he wanted to be someone they remembered. He'd gotten that. He was exactly who he'd said he'd become. You should talk to your daughter, she said. His crest moved, a small motion, almost suppressed. The first uncontrolled expression she'd seen from him in 20 years. She's in the Verith, Mail said. She came here on purpose, to stand between you and this. She watched his face. She loves this place, Steph Khan. The way I loved it. The way you might have if you'd let yourself. She stopped. She's better than either of us. That's the thing you should know. You made something better than yourself, and I've been watching it happen for 3 years. And it is the only thing in this entire situation that surprises me anymore. He said nothing for a long time. His command scanner showed the disrupted patrol craft, the downed bridge, the positions of his ground units. It showed him the tactical reality, which was not in his favor in the Vareth at night. He knew it. She knew that he knew it. The marker, he said. I'm lifting it, she said. Right now. Diaval has the access. It's gone. He went very still. Not because I'm afraid of you, she said. Not because you've given me anything. Because she asked me to the day before yesterday, when she said she didn't want to be the reason. Because she's 16 and she came here on purpose, and she reminded me of why I learned to love this place in the first place, and I don't want her to carry what I've been carrying. She paused. I had wings once. They were stolen from me. I've spent 20 years proving that I could survive without them, and I have, and I'm finished proving it. The clearing was very quiet. The bioluminescent fungi pulsed slowly around them, unhurried, indifferent to the drama of the creatures standing in their light. Pull your forces back, she said. Take the treaty revision that the Frontier Command has been offering for 2 years. It gives the Dominion the mineral survey rights in the northern Vareth corridor in exchange for a demilitarized status on the eastern boundary. It's a fair deal. Your economists know it's a fair deal. You've been refusing it because accepting it meant accepting that a human built a defensive position you couldn't break. She met his eyes. You can't break it. Accept the deal. He looked at her for a long time, then his crest lowered. Not flat, not the zero expression he'd worn at the commissioning ceremony, lower than that. The angle, in Velkhari body language, meant something Mael had not seen a Velkhari direct at a human in her lifetime. It was the posture of acknowledgement between equals, the gesture that said, I see you, I see what you did here, and what it cost and what it is. He issued the recall order to his units. Then he walked back to his shuttle, and the thrusters fired, and the clearing was empty except for the slowly pulsing light of a world that had decided again to let them stay. They found Rora by the thermal ridge, sitting where Mael had sat 20 years ago, legs dangling over the canyon drop. The bioluminescent root networks floated above her, drifting in the warm updraft. She looked up when they approached, Mael and Diaval, both them carrying the specific exhaustion of people who just prevented something large. The marker's gone, Rora said. Yes, he pulled back. Yes. Rora looked at the canyon for a while. Then she said, Do you miss it? The harness. Mael sat beside her. The edge of the thermal ridge, in the dark, with the warm air coming up from below. The same updraft she'd used to fly 20 years ago, before any of this. Every day, she said. Rora reached into the pack she'd been carrying and set something down between them on the stone. Mael looked at it. It was small, sealed in a transport case, the kind used for sensitive electronics. She recognized the housing before she opened it. He's had it for 20 years, Rora said. I took it before I left. I didn't know if it would still work. The neural interface filaments are intact. The Dominion research team preserved them. She paused. My mother is a surgeon. She said if the original microchannels in your tissue are still viable, the reinstallation is possible. Mael looked at the case for a long time. It might not work, Rora said. 20 years is a long time. Yes, Mael said. Do you want to try? The thermal updraft moved through the canyon below them, warm and constant, the way it had always been. The way it would be long after all of them were finished with whatever they were each trying to be in this borrowed world. Yes, she said. Diaval said nothing, which from him was the same as saying everything. The Vareth breathed around them, phosphorescent and patient, and did not ask for anything except that they stay, and try, and be willing to want something beyond the thing they'd lost. That had always been the price of it. That had always been, Mael thought, a fair deal. She picked up the case. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The weight of a thing returned, the specific gravity of something you'd stopped expecting. Then she tucked it carefully against her chest, stood, and looked out over the canyon, where the root networks drifted slow and enormous in the dark, and the bioluminescent light pulsed in rhythms that had nothing to do with human time and everything to do with the fact that this place had been here before any of them, and would be here after, and had chosen, in its patient alien way, to be beautiful in front of witnesses. Come on, she said to both of them. We should get off the ridge before the warden's shift changes. Rora stood. Diaval stood. The three of them walked back through the Vareth in the dark, through the warm air and the living light, toward whatever came next. It was not the ending Mael had planned for. She had spent 20 years planning a different kind of ending. The one where she got everything back, or nothing, or at least something clean. This one was messier. It had a gap in it where the harness still wasn't in her back, and a girl who was Stefkan's daughter, and a man who had pulled his forces back without apology, but also without conditions, and a world that kept choosing to let them stay in it, messier than planned. She found, walking through the Vareth dark, that she could live with that. She had wings once. Maybe she would again. She held the possibility carefully, the way you hold a thing that hasn't happened yet, and kept walking.